Good Thursday night, and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on the Newsfeed Late Night. I am Thabo Mdluli. Tonight we are, of course, talking the transformation agenda of the country and the role of market forces. Do they unnecessarily limit the developmental agenda of the country, and who is really leading the economic policy in South Africa? And most times many say the private sector is leading the economic policy and government seemingly is following, and the preconditions which the market forces are putting in place are quite inhibitive to the transformation agenda we would like to see in the country. I'd like to get your views on that one tonight. Joining me is former Trade and Industry Minister and SACP member Rob Davies, and we also have Duma Gqubule, who is the founding director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. To be a part of the conversation tonight, tag us on Twitter at Newzroom 405, or you can WhatsApp your questions and comments to 072 110 5584. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on the Newsfeed Late Night.
Good evening.
Good evening, Thabo. How are you?
I'm well, thank you very much. Let's begin with you, Duma. Is the private sector and government in South Africa overly subservient to market forces, right? In as far as, I suppose, bending to their every demand?
You know, Thabo, this is a very interesting debate, and there's so many different angles to it. I'm not exactly sure where to start. But I think over the past 2 or 3 decades, there's been a debate in economic policy around the liberalization of financial markets as to how much power do financial markets have. I remember back in the day, there was this advisor to Bill Clinton who talked about the bond market. I think he was saying that the bond market can bully governments into implementing the policies that they want. But if you just step back and talk about now, there's a whole new framework that I found quite interesting. It's called monetary theory, and they have certain conditions. They talk about monetary sovereignty, and they talk about a certain spectrum of monetary sovereignty. So they say that a country must borrow in its own currency. Number 2, it must not fix its currency against something that it might run out of. For example, fix against another currency like you saw in Greece. So they say that these countries have more monetary sovereignty if you can meet those conditions. Now let's start with fixing your currency. Now, if you fix your currency, I've looked at all the emerging market crises, for example, over the past 4 decades, and every single one of them, the countries accumulated a large foreign exchange debts, whether it was in Mexico in 1982 to Russia in 1998. So those countries had what we call the emerging market crisis. We had a crisis in 1998 and so forth. Yeah. So what I want to say is that, number 1, South Africa has a unique privilege amongst developing countries. Only 10% of our debt is denominated in foreign currency, and about 30% of our bond market is owned owned by foreigners, but about 10%. That's what I'm trying to say. And then also we have about 40% of our stock market is owned by foreigners. So what I'm trying to say is that we are not in the same situation as many developing countries. And I would argue we haven't really had a proper currency crisis in South Africa, at least in the post-apartheid period. We've had episodes, which in 1998 we had with the emerging market crisis, but it wasn't caused. It was the response that our central bank had to the crisis that that made the crisis worse. And we had a currency crisis in 2001, and we also had some crisis when the market was, when they released the mining charter. And I can think of a few others that we've had, and with the Mdluli situation. But the market corrected, I think, within 3 weeks of Mdluli being fired as a minister. And some of the figures that were quoted at the time, that 500 billion rand left the country and we lost because of the firing of Mdluli, are quite simply not true, because the markets, I think, regained most of their. It took about 3 weeks, the last time I looked at this, for the markets to regain stability. So I would argue, in my memory, we haven't really had a true a currency crisis like you have in many other emerging markets.
Right. Rob, is government and private sector overly obsessed with the macroeconomic stability leading to, I suppose one would say, the country not pursuing its real developmental agenda and addressing the needs of the magnitude who are poor?
Well, I think I would go back to the early 90s and a book that was written at the time by someone called Thomas Friedman. This is the onset of the phase of globalization and neoliberalism. And he basically said, and I think this was a kind of a pop version of the advice that was given to governments around the world, that you must put on the golden straitjacket and you must prioritize all of these macroeconomic variables. You must make sure your budget deficit doesn't rise above 3%. Inflation must be single digits and falling, and so on and so on. The promise that was held out at the time was that if this happens, there's a royal road to prosperity, the world of the Lexus. He said, if you don't do it, you'll be confined to lower level economic activities, the world of the olive tree. But I think that we've been through all of that. And many, many countries around the world were persuaded to prioritize the financial macroeconomic variables according to what Joseph Stiglitz called the ready reckoner. Didn't matter what your situation was, didn't matter what your developmental challenges were, you just had to hit these numbers all the time. And I think that's the essence of neoliberalism and also of the austerity message, which is being driven to developing countries even now as we are trying to recover from the COVID emergency, but which is manifestly not being practiced by the largest economies in the developed world. So UNCTAD has reported that just recently, even before the last package announced by Joe Biden of $2 trillion to support infrastructure in the United States, it was reported that the developed countries are amassing huge arsenals of about 20 to 25% of their GDP to support recovery, because they know that without a recovery program, you're not going to get the jobs and the poverty resolved and the inequality dissipated to some degree without a recovery program. On the other end of the spectrum, many, many developing countries are being persuaded or cajoled into accepting austerity. So as according to UNCTAD, the poorest developing countries of a much lower GDP are mobilizing less than 1%. So I think the risk is that we will see vaccine apartheid, where we've seen hoarding of the vaccines by the developed world, followed by recovery apartheid. And if that happens, the inequality will widen in the world, and the developing world will not have the opportunity to follow the developmental trajectory which allows it to move into higher value-added activities, to have active state involvement in the development and implementation of an industrial policy, and we also won't be able to meet the immediate needs of our people. Yep. And I think that in South Africa, my take is that we've got a very contradictory situation. In NEDLAC, through processes of consultation, but give and take, we've got a relatively progressive economic recovery and reconstruction program. And then we find when it comes to the budget and when it comes to the potential use of non-orthodox monetary policy tools of the sort that Duma was talking about, we don't want to go there. And we have, I think, these programs, these recovery programs, potentially and actually held back by the decisions.
Why does that happen? You are in government. One can listen to you now, Rob, and say, well, Rob is talking like this now because he doesn't have the shackles of being a minister, and therefore he doesn't have to carve his message and couch his message properly just in case the markets are going to wake up tomorrow and they are upset. Hence, you're saying you could agree on something at NEDLAC, but the Minister of Finance, when he has to couch his message, he's got to put it in such a way that the bond markets are happy, that the commodities markets are happy, that the services markets are happy. Why do we do that?
Well, I think that we did it because we were under the sword of Damocles of the rating agencies. Now they've played their card. They've downgraded us. And I don't know what the imperative to continue to try to appease them, because we're not coming back into investment grade anytime soon. And in fact, I think that the route to reducing budget numbers and other macroeconomic numbers is to grow the economy. And through that, we increase revenue, and that means that the budget deficit is potentially reduced. The other route of trying to reduce the budget deficit in a period of downturn where we are now by cutting expenditure is actually to act with the cycle pro-cyclically. So yes, I am not in government, and I'm able to take advantage of that to use whatever experience and skills I may or may not have to analyze the situation independently but not independently in terms of my own commitment to what I think is the most important thing. We should be focusing laser-like and absolutely critically above all else on the reduction of poverty, inequality and unemployment. And if that is not happening on a sufficient scale, we should be willing to adjust policy programs to make sure that we see that and we see a recovery that is much more inclusive than we've seen up to now.
Who is leading our economic policy? Is it the private sector and government following, or the other way around? We'll try and get to that question when we continue here on the Newsfeed Late Night with the former Trade and Industry Minister, Rob Davies, and Duma Gqubule from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. You're a part of the conversation tonight at Newzroom 405. WhatsApp your questions as well. Back with you on the Newsfeed Late Night, and the conversation tonight around the role of market forces and their limiting or unlimiting factor in as far as meeting our developmental goals. The former Trade and Industry Minister, Rob Davies, and member of the SACP, Duma Gqubule from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, my guests tonight. You're a part of the conversation, tagging us on Twitter at Newsroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments to 072-110-5584. Duma, before the break, I'd asked that question, and maybe I want you to also talk to it a little bit. Why do we place so much emphasis in couching our messages correctly to say the right things to the various markets at different times?
You know, I actually don't understand. As I was saying before the break, that over the past 27 years, I've never seen, there have been episodes of market instability, but we've never had a full-on currency crisis or a market crisis. So I don't understand why our politicians pay so much attention to what the markets will say. I don't think they have much power over our ability to chart an independent macroeconomic policy. You know, just I would agree with Rob, is that the old orthodoxies have collapsed, and the global stimulus packages were about 16 trillion since the start of the pandemic. That is 17% of world GDP. I just finished a report that we launched today with SPI, an organization, and for the Financial Transparency Coalition, an NGO an international NGO. And we found that our stimulus package in South Africa was about 123.5 billion rands. It was 2.5% of GDP, compared with $16 trillion in the rest of the world. Now, how did the rest of the world finance those stimulus packages? Their central banks financed a big portion of those stimulus packages. And for example, in the United Kingdom, 92% of the 485 billion pounds that were borrowed this year were from the central bank. So the central banks came to the parties and provided direct financing to the governments. And for the first time in the history, in recent history, emerging markets, according to the IMF, 27 emerging markets had these, what Rob was calling, unorthodox monetary policies, where the central banks of the developing countries started supporting their governments in their responses to the crisis. And what the IMF found was that there was no punishment for these countries, the 27 countries that implemented these unorthodox economic policies. So I would argue, Thabo, that we are living in a time warp from 2 decades ago. Economic policy environment has changed beyond recognition at the moment. And what was not allowed in the past, maybe 10 or 20 years ago, is becoming part of the mainstream. I even read recently about, in the Financial Times, a report about the so-called debt crisis in emerging markets. And what they said, that the markets don't really care about the level of debt, because our debt is not necessarily high by international standards. They want to know, do you have a growth story? So India, which has got a higher debt to GDP ratio than South Africa, 90%, the markets are quite relaxed about the Indian situation and other countries.
You're saying two things there. You're saying the markets don't care. All they want to hear is your growth story. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, they want to hear the growth story.
Do you think the rating agencies will ever understand, for example, our need to redistribute land, or the land distribution policy in the country?
Well, I've looked at the ratings report, and I don't think we should put much weight to the reports. And I think for the year or two before we were downgraded, I correctly predicted, Thabo, that nothing would happen the day we were downgraded. So when we were downgraded on 27th March, nothing happened, the currency appreciated. We were downgraded a few months later, nothing happened, the currency appreciated. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that these rating agencies, they do not have the power to dictate our economic policies because the markets themselves, I believe, don't take the ratings agencies serious. Many times in history, the markets ignore what the rating agent. Let me just explain to you why. Yeah. The main reason for that is that everybody can take a view on what the prospects for South African debt, Venezuelan debt, or whatever debt, but they don't. They do that every day without reading a ratings report. So decisions are made every day that have got nothing to do with the ratings reports. That's what I'm trying to say.
Is the emphasis on the growth policy misplaced, though? I mean, with the implicit...
No, we need a growth policy, definitely.
The assumption is that if the economy grows at a high enough level, things will be hunky-dory. All of a sudden, the poor will be better, and the psychosocial impact of racism and violence and spatial dislocation, all those things will be fixed. I mean, that's not necessarily true, is it?
No. The only way to get to become fiscally sustainable is to have growth. Because if the debt is measured as a percentage of GDP. So now what austerity does, it's self-defeating. It reduces GDP and it makes you have a higher debt ratio. That is what we saw in Greece recently, over the 10 years ago. So what I'm trying to say is that the only way for us to recover from this crisis, our GDP collapsed by 7.2% last year. GDP per capita is now where it was in 2006. So this crisis has wiped out 15 years of growth in GDP per capita. And the government now is planning to withdraw 265 billion rands over the next 3 years in terms of austerity measures, while the rest of the world is trying to inject new money into the economy. Right. So what we are doing now, I think correctly what people are saying is that South Africa's economic policies are going to worsen the crisis, and the other countries that are spending money to get out of the crisis, they will get out of that crisis.
Rob, is the fiscal discipline an important precondition for economic growth?
Well, I agree very much with what Duma was saying, that the way to fiscal sustainability is by having a growth story. And I think that the foreign investors that count, those involved in FDI, foreign direct investment, as opposed to bond markets and short-term capital that moves in and out. Those investors, they want to see that there is a real environment in the economy, in the real economy, that is going to yield them a rate of return, and they care much less about the fiscal frameworks and the broad policy frameworks. If that weren't the case, why did they all flood into China when China was growing, despite the fact that China manifestly didn't follow the policy advice that's given by the Bretton Woods institutions, the rating agencies, and the like? So I think that's the issue for us. I mentioned it earlier, but what Joseph Stiglitz said was when these policies were being developed in the 1990s, they were one size fits all. They took little account of the circumstances on the ground, little account of the real economy, little account of the developmental challenges, and somehow imagined that you could apply the same ratios and the same priority across the world, and that manifestly didn't work. And as Duma is saying right now, and I coined this phrase, recovery apartheid, to follow vaccine apartheid. We'll see the developed world pumping huge amounts of money in recovery. Recovering better than they did in 2008, where it was money for bank bailouts, tax cuts for the rich, and so on. Yeah. They'll recover better. But you will have a widening gap between the developed and the developing world. And if we want to, inflict wounds on ourselves that we don't need to, I think we will fall into the more unfortunate part of the world, because recovery from this pandemic or the economic effects of the pandemic are not going to happen through market forces alone. Market forces are going to leave many people behind. People who lost jobs in service industries, low skilled service industries, in entertainment industries, catering industries. travel and tourism and those sorts of things, those jobs aren't going to rebound soon. The idea that there's just going to be a rebound, an automatic rebound, everything's going to look fine, this is not going to happen across the board. And by the way, any growth rate that we get now has to be taken into account what Duma's mentioned before, that we had a 7% reduction. The base has declined.
Yeah.
And the Reserve Bank is telling us we're not going to hit the level of GDP before of 2019, which was a year of crisis itself. We won't even go back to the crisis before the crisis for another 2 years or so. GDP per capita through the normal recovery, the bounce back, will be much, much, much delayed. And then all the effects on hunger, on poverty, on unemployment, there are just so many rigidities. We need a stimulus that's going to make some impact. I think that's the essential point I would want to make here.
Who is then leading, Rob, the policy, right? Growth policy or economic policy, so to speak. For example, if we talk of a growth rate of between 2 to 3%, right? Is that adequate, or is it only adequate for the top 10% of the country that is already earning well? I mean, is it adequate for the majority, 60% of the magnitude that are living in poverty and squalor?
Well, I think we have to talk not just about the quantity of growth, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We also need to talk about the quality of it. It needs to be more inclusive. It needs to be directed in different directions and bringing more people in. And without actual programs, that's not going to happen. So I think the point is that 2% growth after a 7% decline is not the same as having had 2% growth back in 2019 before we had the 7% decline. It's just a fact of mathematics, which is often forgotten by people that just look at the growth rate. We would need to have actually something closer to 10 to 14% growth after a decline of 7% to get back to where we were before. And that's not what we've got on the table. That's not what the bounce back is taking us to. So I think that the point is that we need an active stimulus program that's going to target recovery sectors, and also going to have to target people's incomes, because people have lost incomes in this pandemic, and many of them are not going to get them back easily.
We look at the investment criteria demanded by the FDIs when we continue next here on the Newsfeed Late Night. The former Trade and Industry Minister, Rob Davies, and Duma Gqubule from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation with us tonight. We'll take your questions as well tonight at Newzroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments, 072-110-5584. The Newsfeed Late Night continues next. You're back with us on the Newsfeed Late Night. I see lots of your questions coming through as well tonight on WhatsApp. Keep them coming, 072-110-5584, or tag us on Twitter at Newzroom 405. With us in conversation tonight, former Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies, and member of the SACP, as well as Duma Gqubule from the Center for Economic Development and Transformation. And of course, the question that I wanted to put to both of you before the break, Duma and Rob, we'll start with you, Rob. Are you saying that we should, for example, ignore some of the conditions or even investment criteria that some of the investors put, for example, like low tax environment or cost of labor being low, or political certainty or friendly policies, for example?
Well, I think that we need to try to look much more concretely at what it is that an investor needs when they come into the country, and try to offer them a relatively hassle-free ride as they come in and they set up a factory or whatever else it may be. So I think that that kind of exercise, which has been undertaken through a number of agencies in the past, and which is a priority up to now, I think that's fine. What I do think, though, is that we need to look critically at the sort of overall policy advice that comes from agencies which are not actually direct investors themselves. You say that the investors want this, investors want the other thing. And I think that that's not necessarily the actual operator of an automotive company, or the actual operator of a pharmaceutical investment, or whatever it may be. they are tend to be agencies or and private rating agencies. And by the way, there's a huge critique now which has been mounted of the rating agencies. They manifestly got things wrong during the 2008 Great Recession. They gave a number of the financial institutions in the United States, they gave them AAA ratings when a few months later they collapsed because they were full of toxic debt. And then from then onwards, these agencies have been super cautious because they're very concerned. And they wield enormous power. And there's now a call for these agencies, which are just private institutions, that these agencies should actually be brought under some a more substantial multilateral regulatory framework. And I think that that's something else to bear in mind. So I think that we must be careful of when we say the voice of the market or the voice of this, I mean, actually who is articulating that and what does it mean? And as I said earlier, sometimes we have cases where countries have followed all that advice and got no investment. And we've had other cases where countries didn't follow that advice, set out on their own crafted developmental strategy. The case in point is China, but you can go before that. You can go to Southeast Asian countries like Korea, Taiwan, and others. And what happened was investors needed to move in there because there was money to be made. And whatever they thought of the broad policy framework, they got in. So I think if someone comes and tells us that we must go into wage suppression, which is what you mentioned, well, wage suppression has happened across the world. The share of labor to GDP has declined massively across the world and also in South Africa. And I think that is not necessarily a recipe for what you said before, a stable environment. You can try to force wage suppression policies through, but you also don't want to have labor unrest. And maybe you can get one, but you can't get both together.
Duma, investment criteria and how there's a view out there that investors, for example, use that muscle to invest or not to invest to push government into a corner. For example, on low taxes, on low labor costs, on favorable policies. When you talk, for example, things like in the mines, once empowered, always empowered, and these things get people hot under the collar. Should we just ignore that?
Yes, I agree. What we need for investment, above all, is a growth story. South Africa does not have a growth story. What we have now, we've got 47% unemployment amongst Black Africans. The unemployment rate amongst Black African females is 51%. The unemployment rate in the Eastern Cape is 52%, the expanded rate. So what we need is a growth story to create jobs for our people. Everything else is secondary. And I just have to mention, in terms of investment, the major reason for the collapse of investment since 2015 has been a public sector investment strike. So the public sector between 2000, we've had 4 consecutive years of declining total investment. And the main reason for that is the public sector. So you can't expect domestic investors, private ones, and foreign investors to invest in the economy when the government itself is not taking the lead. So what we have to do, the government talks about an infrastructure-led recovery strategy, but what we're seeing is that National Treasury has forecast for 2021 another decline in total investment, because what it means that Treasury doesn't actually believe that there is this infrastructure-led growth strategy. So let me just look back to what happened between 2003 and 2008. The government led the investment process and the private sector followed. So you don't get us, we are putting the cart before the horse. The government has to lead and the private sector will follow. That's what I believe we have to do in terms of investment. And you can't have investment by the public sector within the context of 3 years of austerity budgets. We have to, the most urgent imperative in South Africa right now is to put an end to the austerity and, as Rob was saying, to have a credible growth story, a growth strategy for this country that will inject new money into the economy. The whole world is injecting new money into their economies. I'm talking about major developing countries and major developed countries. why is South Africa different? Why do we think by withdrawing 265 billion rands from our economy, we can create a growth story? It doesn't work like that.
Can we jump straight from stagnation, as far as growth is concerned, into inclusive growth that is radical? If so, what are the elements that will take us there and what elements will not?
I think what we need to do, we need to calibrate our recovery strategy. We have to provide relief to households, as Rob was saying. So that should be one portion of the stimulus package. Then we must create jobs in terms of proper infrastructure-led recovery, number two. And then we must change the composition of the jobs through industrial strategy, because industrial strategy can change the growth, the labor intensity of the growth path that we create. So those are the three things that I think that we should do as a country. But the most important one is to end, because there cannot be any development in South Africa with these self-defeating, harmful austerity policies that the government is implementing.
Rob, can we jump straight from stagnation into inclusive growth that is radical in nature? What are the elements and what do we need to look at and what we need to avoid?
Well, as Duma was saying as well, and I said earlier, I think that we need an active recovery package. And I think just one example that I would give of the contradiction that I think is around is that the public employment program that has emerged from the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction program, for those who are experts in the area, and I'm not, they'll say this is a much better program than we've ever had before. It's got its own budget instead of just being part of in multiple departments' budgets. It's better organized. It's led in the presidency and so on. But then to just show the contradiction, it had 10% of its budget cut. Now, how can that happen when unemployment and job creation is such a high priority? So I do think that the elements of inclusivity are that we do have to look at the big structural weaknesses of the South African economy, along with the rest of the African economy. And what's happened is that we haven't, as a continent as a whole, we haven't escaped from our position as being mere producers and exporters of some primary commodity that's used in somebody else's manufacturing process elsewhere. With the fourth industrial revolution, the value of the raw material and the final products is just diminishing. It's the worst place to be in the global division of labor. All countries that have transitioned from being underdeveloped to developed have gone through a period of economic diversification and value addition. They've industrialized, in other words. We deindustrialized with excessive tariff cuts in the early 1990s, driven by neoliberalism. Unfortunately, that happened. Then we tried to, during my time, we tried to put a bit of a brake on it and try to develop some industrial policy. That, as I argue in my book, which is just coming out, that this got overwhelmed by state capture and corruption, the demobilization of a number of important instruments for industrial policies. So that's one trench of struggle that we have to ensure that we actually put in place accountability and ensure that we recover the capacity of public institutions. But we've also got to look at distribution. We've got to have taxation policies, I think, that are overtly redistributive. We've got to have our public services much more effective in terms of their impact on poorer communities. And we can't allow the situation that we see it far too often of municipalities and others not performing their core functions because some or other individual or group within them is basically managing tenders to the benefit of small cliques and political factions and so on. We've got to clean up that act as well. But I think that we can't afford to allow these the state of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. We've just sort of kind of got used to it, and I think it's got worse now. And if we don't actively target and prioritize an improvement in that regard, I think that we are going to find ourselves in deep trouble as a society in the years and decades ahead. Another thing, by the way,
what is happening at NEDLEC as we speak employment, right? There is a perception that private sector believes that policies that are more worker-focused will discourage investment, right? And therefore, if we, for example, talk higher wages and profitability, those two things don't coexist. What is the conversation at NEDLAC, and is Labour failing to convince the private sector on that particular point?
Well, I can't say exactly what the conversations are at NEDLAC because I haven't been there, but I think we kind of know what has happened, that an individual employer doesn't actually want all the workers in the economy to have their wages suppressed, because what that would mean would be that the market for their goods is so much reduced. What they want is they want their own wages to be suppressed so that their profits can rise. And I think that's the kind of contradiction on the side of capital on this kind of issue. Yes, I mean, there's been demands over time for labor market flexibility and reduction of particular rights to organize. But I think that many investors and employers over time have got used to the reality. This is a democratic society, and this is not a society that's going to encourage a race to the bottom on wages. And by the way, we're entering the fourth industrial revolution. It was just a few years ago that Adidas announced that it was bringing back a number of production processes to Germany from Bangladesh because it said that the use of robotics and 3D printing lowered its production costs a lot more than the value of the cheap wages in a place like Bangladesh. So I think they're trying to compete on low wages rather than on a workforce which is actually capable and able to master the new technologies that are emerging. I think that's also a yesterday's game and not one that worked even yesterday.
We'll take some of your comments and questions in a moment when we do continue. My guest tonight, former Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies, member of the SACP, as well as the founding director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule. Let's look at your tweets tonight at Newzroom 405. WhatsApp your questions and your comments on 072-110. The news feed late night continues for you now here on Newzroom Africa, channel 405. My guest tonight, former Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies, and the founding director for the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule. Let's go to the WhatsApp messages coming through tonight. Here's one coming from Sipho saying, to me, there seems to be a contradiction within government itself as to who is championing economic policy. Is it the DTI or National Treasury? To me, National Treasury seems to be the most powerful in dictating and leading the debate, and this has opened the back door for markets to have big influence on the economy rather than the state leading the development agenda through the implementation of the industrial policy. So that's a mouthful, Rob and Duma. Maybe, Rob, just tackle the first part of it. First is who's leading or championing the economic policy. The second part of it is what happens if Treasury is leading? Does that give the back door to markets to have big influence rather than, of course, the state leading the developmental agenda?
Well, let me just say that successful industrializing countries, going back to Japan, through Korea, and later into China, the sort of leading agencies in government were the Ministry of Trade and Industry of Japan and their equivalents in the other countries. They were those real economy, transformative, industrial policy orientated departments. The neoliberal state asserted finance and financial ministries of finance as the dominant institutions because the name of the game was to quote unquote get the macroeconomic balances right and to withdraw the state from an active role in the economy. And I think that we've seen where that's gone. So I think that in South Africa we followed the trend. I mean, that's the problem. We follow the trends. And we follow the wrong trends. And I think at the moment what I'm trying to say is it seems to me as an outsider, no longer in government, I'm not privy to any of the interactions that take place, but it seems to me that there are relatively progressive policies and programs that emerged through the real economy institutions and departments in institutions like NEDLAC. And then quite often what they come up with gets chopped when it comes to the deployment of the resources necessary to get us onto a new and more inclusive growth path. And I think that's the inherent contradiction that we've got around, and probably the biggest barrier to us having a more inclusive new growth path, I think, is that we continue to internalize and buy into too much of the argument of austerity and neoliberal austerity in particular.
This one from Tina. The argument presented is solid. What of BRICS, though, and the alternative it promises? Is it still part of government policy and framework as alternative to economic development globally? Duma, as far as you know?
You know, I haven't followed the BRICS debate. I've been to China a couple of times. But let me just say about industrial policy is that the industrialization, the industrial financing, the incentives of the DTI over the past 4 years, I was reading the budget, have declined by almost 30%, from 7 billion rands to 5 billion rands. So what you see in this year is that the contribution of the government, of that 5 billion rands, 43% goes to the automotive scheme, and that automotive scheme, according to the DTI, will create 900 jobs. So the money that is left, another 3 billion rands, is for the whole economy. So if you add, so the government contribution towards this industrial policy is very small. And if you add the IDC, which is 12 billion rands, you get a figure of 17 billion rands. But that is only 0.3% of our GDP. And I just have to say, Thabo, my favorite topic that I really like talking about is that the complete lack of funding for black small and medium enterprises, which should be front and center of any strategy to develop this economy and diversify the structure of our economy. The Small Enterprise Finance Agency, 1.3 billion rands in the latest financial year. The National Empowerment Fund, 300 million rands. The National Empowerment Fund has never got a cent from government since 2010. It's a miracle that the National Empowerment Fund still operates. I was talking to a board member, and the board member, she told me that they live on collections. So if the government is serious about black economic empowerment, transforming our economy, all these big three, big four that exist in every sector of the economy, and you provide a pitiful 1.6 billion rands towards funding of black, small and medium enterprises, I think we should be doing much more. And the other thing I want to talk about, I've tried to talk to the Land Bank. They don't release figures on black emerging farmers. They refuse point blank. And if you look at the private sector, the banks, the latest report says the total balance sheet exposure of banks towards black SMEs in terms of their financial sector commitments is 28 billion. That is 0.5% of their assets. So if we're really serious about changing the structure of this economy, we have to provide direct funding in terms of creating these businesses that will grow the economy and create jobs.
All right, T-Man on WhatsApp sending us a message. The private sector is and will continue to lead and bully the government because of our government doesn't have plans to grow the economy. They depend on the private sector. And that's essentially the sentiment that has led us having this conversation tonight, Rob, that there is this perception and a sense from those who are outside looking in that the government is being bullied into a corner, and therefore we'll never see transformation really happen.
Well, I think there's the different dynamics at play. I mean, some of them I think are the kind of international dynamics and the role of international institutions and the perception that we need to try to appear to be, good boys and girls in relation to them. And then there's the domestic scene, and I think the domestic scene we've got a lot of threats of not investing, which I think you're picking up on. We're not investing because of this and that and the other thing. And then if you change this and that and the other thing, it doesn't really make a lot of difference because that's not the real reason that you find in the first instance. I think in successful developing and emerging economies, what happens is that the state defines a framework. The state defines a framework and mobilizes a set of instruments. And then if you're going to have a successful industrial policy, and in my book, I say that during our time, I think that the weakness of the industrial policy we tried was that it was relegated to the work of one department. It wasn't seen as something that the whole of government was committed to, and many other decisions that were actually quite important in terms of moving industrial policy further forward were shaped by other factors and things. I just read a book on China. China maintained a competitive value for its currency right through its industrialization process because it realized that would give a competitive edge to its own local industries in their own market, and also allow them to play in foreign markets much more competitively. I mean, in our case, we just withdraw from attempting to influence the exchange rate, even though when we started our industrial policy action plan, that was a fairly live issue. We did have an overvalued exchange rate at the time. What were we going to do about it? Just live with it. I think that's the kind of problem that we have had. And so I think instead of having the sort of relationship where there's a framework, a strategy set by government in consultation with others, but led by government, and then the private sector takes place, we have rather too much transactional bargaining that takes place, and transactional bargaining around some short-term demand against some very vague commitment, and sometimes that very vague commitment is not followed through. So I think just look at I don't have the figures like Duma has, but just look at the commitments that were made during COVID to provide guarantees to banks so that they were going to unleash funds for small businesses. Some minuscule proportion of that funding was actually deployed, and I think that's the kind of problem that we've got.
Duma,
I just want to make a point. I think Tina was spot on when she talked about the bullying by the private sector. I've had direct experience of it. I was very involved in the discussions around the mining charter, and I followed the debate around the financial sector charter, although I was less involved. And what you had was blatant bullying by the government, which caved in and made fatal compromises in the design of the charters in the banking and the mining sector, which basically destroyed the government's own policy on transformation. And yes, and in terms of the loan guarantee scheme, it was a 200 billion rand scheme. The banks only lent 18.2 billion rands. And that 18.2 billion rands, it went to prime clients. You saw the Minister of Small Business. She said in Parliament in September that 75% of those loans went to white businesses. So the government, the banks were totally not committed to providing any loans during the worst crisis in a century. So I think we must stand. I mean, what you're seeing, for example, in other countries, the government can't be bullied by private interests in the banks and the mines. So I do agree with Tina that the banking sector and the mining sector have got too much power to dictate economic policy in this country.
And finally, how do we find that right balance? Rob was talking about a balance between the power of the market forces, the private initiative, and of course, on the other hand, the obligation for government to provide an enabling framework that favors inclusive growth.
And Thabo, I'm watching the debates in China now. The government is fighting with Jack Ma and the technology companies. They're reining back control of, they're trying to control their economy. They can't. A sovereign country cannot be dictated to by the private sector. The private sector must know who is in charge. But as Rob was saying, maybe the credibility of the government during this past period of the past 10 years with straight capture has become, the credibility of the government has been eroded. So we need a government that will make decisions in the interests of the people. I'm talking about 47% unemployed South Africans. Everything else is secondary, in my view.
Rob, last bite for yourself, 30 seconds, a brief one.
Well, I would say that I would simply say that of the different business communities, one has to look at the different sectors, and I think that one of the weakest sectors is manufacturing. Who calls the shots, unfortunately, is too often finance. That's got to do with the financialization of the South African economy, where the financial sector was about 6% of GDP in 1994. Now it's over 20%, and with that has gone power. And that power is not really being harnessed or used for developmental purposes, and that, I think, is something that we need to confront as well. Thank you very much.
Former Trade and Industry Minister Rob Davies, appreciate your time. Founding Director of the Center for Economic Development and Transformation, Duma Gqubule. And thanks to you tonight for your messages that you sent through. The recovery plan for the tourism sector next year on the Newsfeed Late Night. We'll speak to the the CEO of the Tourism Business Council of South Africa, Chifiwa Chibengwa. Stay with us.